Have you ever wondered what secret deals shaped the foundation of the Americas before there even was a United States? Not the tidy classroom stories with noble explorers and friendly feasts, but the unspoken pacts whispered in candlelit rooms, the betrayals inked in private letters, the plans hidden between the lines of official proclamations. Before the Revolution, before the colonies were united, before the names we know filled the history books, there were conspiracies, deals between empires that were never announced, arrangements between colonists and native nations that were buried in archives or erased altogether, and cover-ups so thorough that only fragments remain centuries later. The story of early America isn't just a tale of colonization and expansion, it's also a story of manipulation, strategy, and power plays happening out of sight. Every famous event had a shadow behind it, a parallel version that was never meant to be known. And these conspiracies weren't harmless footnotes. They changed the course of wars, decided who would live on their land and who would lose everything. Today, we're going to step away from the heroic myths and walk straight into that shadow world, the secret history of early America. This is the story of the first American conspiracies, hidden pacts, silent betrayals, and deliberate erasures that set the stage for everything that came after. When people talk about Roanoke, they often speak with a tone of mystery, like it's just an unsolved puzzle carved into a tree. But what's rarely told is that Roanoke didn't start as a peaceful settlement at all. It began as a covert operation. Queen Elizabeth I wasn't just sending explorers across the ocean for glory. She was sending them as a counterattack against Spain's vast empire. Sir Walter Raleigh's charter wasn't about building a utopia. It was about creating a spy post and a pirate base. Roanoke settlers weren't all farmers and families. They included former soldiers, men trained in covert operations during the brutal English campaigns in Ireland. Their mission involved more than building houses. They were meant to intercept Spanish shipping lanes, collect intelligence, and quietly recruit or manipulate nearby native groups to serve as allies against European rivals. That's where the Croatan and Secatan tribes entered the picture. These weren't just friendly neighbors. They were part of early intelligence networks. Exchanges of food and shelter often came with whispered information about rival tribes and Spanish movements. But when the colony vanished, the official reports became strangely vague. Correspondence between the Crown and Raleigh was deliberately sanitized. Entire sections of some records went missing, and the few survivors' accounts that did surface contradicted each other. The famous Croatoan carving has survived in our collective imagination, but the context around it was deliberately buried. It's entirely possible that some colonists were folded into native communities as part of these covert arrangements, while others died in operations or betrayals that the English crown had no interest in explaining. Roanoke may not have been a ghost story after all. It may have been a failed espionage outpost that was quietly erased to save face, to avoid scandal, and to keep England's ambitions hidden from its rivals. The Pilgrim's story is one of the most carefully polished myths in American history. The version we're given paints them as noble refugees seeking religious freedom, humble souls stepping onto a new shore to build a godly community. But behind their voyage in 1620 was a web of deals and financial arrangements as intricate as any modern political operation. These people didn't just hop on the Mayflower because they felt like it. They were backed by a joint stock company that saw the New World as a strategic chessboard, not a spiritual haven. England's goal wasn't just to let a band of separatists escape, it was to outmaneuver the Dutch and the French, to plant a flag in a contested landscape. The famous Mayflower Compact is often hailed as a proto-democratic document, but it also functioned as a control mechanism. It locked dissenters into a hierarchy, ensuring the colony would ultimately benefit its backers. And here's something most classrooms skip entirely. Several of the so-called pilgrims weren't religious separatists at all. They were hired to maintain order and ensure the settlement remained aligned with the financiers' objectives. The alliance with the Wampanoag, too, wasn't born out of kindness. The Wampanoag had been decimated by disease, possibly brought by earlier European contact. They needed a partner to help them stand against the Narragansett. The Pilgrims needed protection, knowledge of the land, and food. Their famous feast wasn't about friendship. It was a celebration of a strategic alliance made in desperation. Behind every prayer and psalm was a calculated move, and in private letters and reports, colonial leaders wrote in blunt terms about trade monopolies, land claims, and military positions. The conspiracy of the Pilgrims wasn't about hiding their faith. It was about hiding the fact that faith was only part of a much bigger game. Jamestown has been remembered as the seed of English America, but its true story is soaked in intrigue, sabotage, and quiet betrayals. From the beginning, Spanish intelligence had already infiltrated English networks. Spain, deeply entrenched in the Caribbean and Florida, was desperate to keep England from establishing a permanent colony in the Chesapeake. So before Jamestown was even built, Spanish agents had information about where and when the English were coming. Early attacks on the settlement were officially blamed on hostile natives, but internal company letters, some only rediscovered centuries later, hint at Spanish involvement in manipulating these conflicts. There were whispers of double agents, of interpreters who worked for both sides, and even inside the colony, things were far from united. Power struggles erupted over leadership, rationing, and loyalty to the Virginia Company's objectives. John Smith's leadership was contested bitterly, and at least one plot was hatched to remove him, possibly permanently. Famine during the starving time wasn't simply the result of harsh winters and bad luck. It was intensified by hoarding, factional infighting, and a breakdown of trust between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. Trust that had always been based on fragile and often secret agreements over hostages, weapons, and tribute. Meanwhile, letters describing these tensions were selectively edited or destroyed before being shared in England to keep investors calm and to present Jamestown as a symbol of perseverance, not chaos. The colony's survival wasn't heroic, it was messy, bloody, and partially hidden behind an official narrative constructed to keep the money flowing, and the public unaware of just how close everything came to collapse. The American continent in the 1600s wasn't a blank map waiting for colonies to bloom. It was a contested stage for an underground war between European empires. Spain controlled massive territories in the south and west. France claimed the north and inland rivers. England clung to its scattered footholds on the coast. But beyond the visible wars were layers of secret diplomacy, unofficial alliances, and covert operations. France courted the Huron, Algonquin, and other nations with gifts, weapons, and promises of partnership, using them as buffers against English and Iroquois expansion. Spain aligned with groups in the southeast, offering military support to keep English settlers penned in. England, lacking the same territorial reach, turned to intelligence and manipulation, sending traders and missionaries as spies promising different tribes conflicting terms to fracture resistance. Many treaties between native nations and Europeans weren't fully written down. They were sealed in private, often with one hand extended and the other crossing behind the back. When these secret agreements were broken, as they often were, the public record was scrubbed. Official accounts claimed misunderstandings or native aggression, when in truth, betrayals had been set in motion long before. Entire wars were kindled not by misunderstandings, but by calculated double-dealing. European powers turned indigenous diplomacy into their own shadow networks, each side trying to outmaneuver the others without open war. The first American conspiracies weren't isolated, they were international. When we talk about conspiracies, we often imagine singular events. But in early America, the greatest conspiracy was long, deliberate, and cultural. It was the rewriting of history itself. When things went wrong, when alliances crumbled, when promises were broken, when atrocities were committed, colonial powers learned to bury the truth beneath layers of official narrative. Treaties that contained secret clauses were rewritten or simply declared invalid. Massacres were reframed as skirmishes. Starvation and betrayal were rebranded as triumphs of endurance. The stories told in Europe were carefully curated to maintain the illusion of order and inevitability. Indigenous voices, who preserved oral histories of these events, were ignored, suppressed, or labeled as unreliable. Some colonial officials even burned records deliberately when leadership changed, erasing inconvenient agreements and rewriting the terms of history to their advantage. Thanksgiving, for example, became a symbol of harmony rather than a product of calculated alliance and looming war. Jamestown became a beacon of perseverance instead of a site of espionage and factional collapse. Roanoke became a harmless mystery, rather than a botched covert mission. Each erasure was a brick in the wall of what became the official American story, a story designed not to inform, but to control how people remembered. The truth was never lost. It was buried. The first American conspiracies weren't the work of shadowy secret societies or invisible cabals. They were built in plain sight, hidden behind flags, noble speeches, and myths that still shape how we think about history today. From Roanoke to Jamestown, from the Pilgrims to the backrooms of empires, early colonial power wasn't just about settlement. It was about control of land, of people, of stories. The deals made in secret-shaped nations, the betrayals that followed shaped centuries, and the cover-ups ensured that most people would never question the myths they grew up with. But the cracks are there if you look closely. Missing documents, contradictory letters, oral histories that tell a different story entirely. What if the real foundation of America wasn't a clean slate, but a web of hidden deals and deliberate silences? What if everything we think of as the beginning is actually just the surface of something much deeper? These conspiracies didn't end with the colonial era. They set a pattern that would echo throughout American history. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.